During the funeral, the cat sat on the tomb of the girl. A real miracle happened in a second. In a moment of deep loss, an unexpected miracle begins to change everything. One man's journey to uncover the truth behind an ancient curse leads him through heartbreak and hope. As he battles the darkness that has haunted his family for generations, he discovers the power of love and the strength to heal. This is a story of finding light in the darkest moments and the courage to rewrite your own future. The sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of rain. It seemed as though the heavens themselves were mourning the loss of the girl whose funeral was taking place beneath the grey clouds. The cemetery was quiet, the only sound being the soft shuffle of footsteps on the damp ground. A small group of people stood huddled around the freshly dug grave, their faces pale and tired from days of grief. Sophia was only 16 when she died. A life cut tragically short. The circumstances of her death were shrouded in mystery. Some whispered of an accident, others spoke of something darker. But none of it mattered now. She was gone, and no one knew why or how. Her mother, Maria, stood near the grave, her eyes red from crying. Her hands trembled as she clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers. She had been close to her daughter, and losing her felt like losing a part of herself. "I don't understand," she whispered to no one in particular. "Why her? Why my Sophia?" A few steps away, her brother Daniel was silent. His face was a mask of stoic detachment, but anyone who looked closely could see the pain behind his eyes. He hadn't cried since the day they found out about Sophia's death. He couldn't, not here, not in front of everyone. As the priest murmured his prayers, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in the trees surrounding the graveyard. Just then, something caught Daniel's attention. A movement at the edge of the cemetery. A cat, a black one, appeared from behind a tombstone. It moved toward the group, its eyes gleaming unnervingly in the dim light. No one else seemed to notice, their attention still fixed on the ceremony. The cat padded across the damp earth, moving with an eerie grace, and without a single glance at the mourners, it jumped onto Sophia's grave. It sat there, perfectly still, as if guarding the tomb. Daniel frowned. He didn't like the feeling this cat gave him. It wasn't just the way it sat so poised, so deliberate. It was something in its eyes, dark and knowing. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Get away from there," he muttered under his breath. He wasn't one to believe in omens or superstitions, but this felt wrong. The cat blinked slowly, almost as though it understood, before it tilted its head slightly to the side. And then, in the silence that followed, something happened. A faint sound, like a whisper, broke the stillness. It came from the direction of the grave, soft at first, but growing louder, clearer. Daniel froze. It wasn't just the wind. It was a voice that seemed to call his name. "Daniel, help!" The voice faded as quickly as it had come, leaving a lingering chill in the air. Everyone around the grave turned their attention to Daniel, who stood frozen, eyes wide. "What is it?" Maria asked, her voice strained. Daniel swallowed hard. Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" his mother asked. He glanced back at the cat. It was still sitting on the tombstone, its eyes glowing faintly. It was almost as though it was waiting for something. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, the strange whisper still echoing in his mind. The cat remained motionless, its glowing eyes fixed on him, and for a moment he was sure the world had stopped. The voice, it had sounded so real, but how could that be? Maria, noticing her son's pale face, took a step toward him. "Daniel, what's wrong?" He shook his head, as if trying to shake off the feeling that was gnawing at him. I swear I heard something. A voice. It called my name." The others around the grave seemed to brush it off as the wind, a trick of the mind. But Daniel couldn't let it go. The air around the grave felt charged with something unnatural. The priest continued his prayers, oblivious to the strange atmosphere. The cat, however, never took its eyes off Daniel. Slowly, as if in response to his lingering gaze, it stood up, turned around, and disappeared behind a nearby tombstone. Maria reached out, placing a hand on her son's arm. "Come, let's go. We need to finish the service." But Daniel hesitated. His gaze lingered on the spot where the cat had vanished. It was as though something in the air was calling him to follow. But the moment passed, and he reluctantly turned away, joining the others at the ceremony. Later that evening, after the funeral had concluded, Daniel found himself alone in his room, staring out the window at the dark sky. The unsettling feeling still lingered. The whisper, the cat, and the inexplicable sense that something wasn't right. They all clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't escape. As he lay in bed that night, trying to sleep, the dream came. It was vivid, so vivid, in fact, that he could feel the cold wind against his skin, hear the rustling leaves. In the dream, he was back at the cemetery, standing by Sophia's grave. The cat was there again, sitting on the tombstone. But this time, it was different. A figure appeared beside the grave, Sophia. Her face was pale, her hair blowing in the wind. She looked at Daniel with empty, hollow eyes. "Help me, Daniel," she whispered. "Find the truth." The dream shifted, and Daniel saw a vision of a hidden part of the cemetery, a forgotten mausoleum in the farthest corner. The figure of Sophia pointed toward it, her voice echoing in his mind. "The answers are there." Daniel woke up with a start, sweat beading on his forehead. The dream felt too real to ignore. He didn't know what it meant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was a message, one he needed to follow. The following morning, Daniel could not shake the sense of urgency that had begun to grow in him. The vision of Sophia, the cryptic message, and the mysterious cat all seemed to be leading him toward something he had to uncover. He left the house early, walking to the cemetery, despite the protests from his mother. She had already noticed his distant demeanor, and though she was worried, she didn't stop him. She believed in letting him grieve in his own way. As Daniel reached the cemetery gates, a strange silence enveloped him. There were no sounds of birds, no whispers in the wind, only stillness. He walked through the rows of graves, his heart racing with each step, until he reached Sophia's tomb. And there it was, again, the cat. It sat silently on top of the tombstone, as if waiting for him. "Why do you keep appearing?" Daniel muttered under his breath. The cat's piercing eyes met his, and this time he didn't feel as uneasy. There was a calmness in its gaze now, as though it knew what he had to do. Suddenly, Daniel heard the whisper again, but this time it was clear and unmistakable. "Follow me." Without thinking, Daniel walked past the grave and toward the far corner of the cemetery, where the forgotten mausoleum from his dream lay hidden among the ivy and old stones. It looked abandoned, its doors locked, but Daniel felt a strange pull toward it. The mausoleum was in worse condition than Daniel had imagined. The door was covered in rust and vines, and the stone steps leading up to it were cracked and worn. Yet, something about it felt familiar. He placed his hand on the cold iron door, and to his surprise, it creaked open slightly, as though it had been waiting for him. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of decay. Daniel stepped inside, cautiously, his heart racing with anticipation. As he moved deeper into the mausoleum, he found a dusty old chest in the back corner. His mind raced. Could this be what the dream had meant? The answers? The truth? He opened the chest carefully. Inside, he found an assortment of old papers, photographs, and a small metal key. As his fingers brushed over the papers, one photo caught his attention. A picture of Sophia, but she was standing next to someone he didn't recognize. The key glimmered in the dim light. It looked like it belonged to a lock that Daniel had never seen before. Back at home, Daniel studied the key. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Delicate with intricate markings. His mind kept returning to the photo, to the stranger beside Sophia. Who was that person? And what was hidden in the box? He showed the photo to his mother, who gasped when she saw it. That's her father, Maria said, her voice trembling. But he disappeared when Sophia was just a child. We never spoke of him after. The mystery deepened. If the man in the photo was Sophia's father, what was he doing in the mausoleum? And what did the key open? The cat's reappearance that evening would change everything. It appeared again at the cemetery, waiting by the mausoleum, as if it had been guiding Daniel all along. "Follow it," Maria whispered, though she too had begun to realize there was something more to the cat than it appeared. As Daniel walked toward the cat, it moved slowly, leading him back to the mausoleum. There, by the door, he noticed a small, hidden compartment that he hadn't seen before. The key fit perfectly. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened the old journal. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink fading in places, but the words were still legible. He sat down at the kitchen table, the heavy weight of the journal in his hands, feeling as though he had just uncovered the first real clue to the mystery surrounding Sophia's death. The entries were scattered, not written in chronological order, but Daniel could make out the general thread of the narrative. His father, obsessed with ancient rituals, had been studying occult practices for years. The journal described a family curse that had been passed down through generations, a curse that had started long before Sophia's birth. It was tied to the pact his ancestors made with a dark force, a force that promised wealth and power in exchange for an unbroken line of servitude. But the price of the pact was far more than Daniel had anticipated. The ritual his father had been attempting to perform was designed to break the curse, but it required the life force of someone with the purest bloodline, a direct descendant. In other words, Sophia. The realization hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. His father had chosen Sophia as the vessel to contain the curse, and in the process, he had unknowingly doomed her. But the ritual had gone wrong. The darkness that had been bound in the family for centuries hadn't been vanquished. Instead, it had consumed Sophia's soul, leaving her spirit trapped between the worlds. Daniel could feel the weight of this revelation, the guilt that his father's obsession had caused his sister's death. Suddenly, a soft sound at the window caught his attention. He turned to see the cat sitting on the sill, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It had followed him inside, just as it had followed him to the mausoleum. For a moment, Daniel simply stared at the cat, his mind racing. Was this creature merely a guardian, or was it somehow tied to the curse itself? The cat blinked slowly, almost as if it understood his thoughts. Its gaze was penetrating, almost knowing, and Daniel had the unsettling feeling that the cat had been waiting for him to uncover the truth. He closed the journal, his hands still shaking. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there was more to uncover. His next step was clear. He needed to find out exactly where his father had performed the ritual and what had gone wrong. Only then could he hope to understand how to free Sophia's spirit and end the curse that had plagued their family for so long. The cat let out a soft meow, almost as if it was urging him to follow. Daniel grabbed his jacket and stepped out into the night, following the cat once again as it led him toward the cemetery where everything had begun. The cemetery was eerily silent as Daniel walked alongside the cat. The air seemed thick, as if the very ground beneath him carried the weight of the generations that had passed through this place. The cat moved with an unhurried grace, its tail flicking back and forth, as though it were fully aware of the significance of what was to come. Daniel's mind raced. The journal had revealed the horrifying truth. Sophia's death wasn't an accident, but a part of a ritual designed to break the family curse. But why had it gone wrong? Why had his father chosen her? He reached Sophia's grave, the freshly turned soil still soft and damp. The cat stopped at the foot of the tombstone, sitting down in front of it. Its gaze seemed focused, intense, as though waiting for something to happen. Daniel looked down at the grave, his thoughts swirling with confusion and sorrow. "Why her?" he whispered aloud, as though hoping the answers would come from the earth itself. The cat turned its head, its golden eyes meeting his, and for the first time, Daniel felt like it was trying to communicate. He bent down, his fingers brushing the edge of the grave, feeling an odd warmth radiating from the stone. It was as if the grave itself was calling out to him, urging him to listen, to understand. Then it hit him. The curse. His family's pact had never been fully broken, despite his father's attempt. Sophia had been a part of that pact, a key in the ritual. But something had gone wrong. The ritual required a sacrifice, but his father had miscalculated. He hadn't understood that the ritual would cost more than just a life. It would cost a soul. And now, Sophia's spirit was trapped, unable to rest. Daniel felt a chill in the air. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. But it wasn't the wind alone that made him shiver. He could feel it, the weight of the curse pressing in on him. He stood up, the cat still watching him with unblinking eyes. He knew what he had to do. There was no going back now. If he wanted to save his sister, to put an end to the curse once and for all, he would have to face whatever awaited him in the shadowy depths of his family's past. The cat let out a soft meow as if to reassure him. Then it turned and began to walk toward the far corner of the cemetery, disappearing into the darkness. Daniel followed, determined to find the answers he so desperately sought. The cemetery seemed larger in the dark, the gravestones looming like silent sentinels. Daniel followed the cat, which moved through the rows of tombstones as though it knew the path well. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the journal and his discovery pressing heavily on him. The cat stopped in front of a large, ancient mausoleum at the edge of the cemetery, half hidden by overgrown ivy. It was a place Daniel had never noticed before, though it seemed familiar in some distant way. The cat sat down in front of the entrance, waiting. Daniel hesitated. He had no idea what lay inside, but he felt the pull of destiny, something deep within him urging him to enter. He reached for the heavy door, which creaked as it opened, revealing a dark interior. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the faint scent of decay hanging in the air. The cat padded ahead, its eyes gleaming in the dark. As Daniel followed, he noticed something strange. The walls were covered with strange symbols, etched deeply into the stone. He ran his fingers over the markings, tracing their patterns. They were familiar, similar to the ones he had seen in the journal. His father must have come here during his search for the ritual, Daniel realized. At the far end of the mausoleum, Daniel found what he was looking for. A large stone chest, half buried under a pile of old, crumbling books. He cleared the debris, his heart racing with anticipation, and opened the chest. Inside was a collection of items that seemed out of place in the mausoleum. Relics, artifacts, and pieces of ancient scrolls. But one item stood out. A small, ornate box covered in intricate carvings. It seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Daniel reached for it, his fingers brushing the surface of the box. As he did, a wave of energy washed over him, cold and powerful. The cat sat at his feet, watching him intently. This was it, the key to the curse, the missing piece of the puzzle. But what did it unlock? Daniel opened the box. Inside, he found a single object, an amulet, worn with age but still shining with an otherworldly light. The amulet seemed to hum with power, and Daniel knew instinctively that it was the key to breaking the curse. But how? The cat's eyes met his, as if urging him to find the answer. Daniel knew the journey was far from over. He had found one piece, but the true test was still ahead. The ancient amulet lay in Daniel's palm, its surface cold against his skin. His mind raced with thoughts of what it might mean, but one thing was clear. It was connected to everything that had happened. His father's obsession, Sophia's death, and the family curse all seemed to converge around this single object. The cat's presence remained a constant comfort, its glowing eyes fixed on him, as though silently urging him to press forward. With a deep breath, Daniel tucked the amulet into his pocket and made his way out of the mausoleum. The moonlight bathed the cemetery in a soft glow, but it wasn't enough to dispel the creeping sense of unease that had settled over him. I need to find answers, Daniel muttered under his breath, determination hardening his resolve. Without thinking, he found himself walking toward the woods on the outskirts of town. The cat trailed behind him, as always, its movements graceful and deliberate. There was something oddly familiar about the forest, though he couldn't place why. Had he been here before? It felt like a place from his childhood, but the memories were hazy, like faded fragments of a dream. The further Daniel ventured into the woods, the thicker the trees became, blocking out most of the moonlight. It was eerily quiet, the only sound being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustling of the wind through the branches. Suddenly, the cat stopped and hissed, its fur standing on end. Daniel froze, instinctively reaching for the amulet in his pocket. Ahead, barely visible through the trees, was a figure, a woman dressed in dark robes, her face obscured by a hood. She stood motionless, watching him. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen her before, yet her presence felt strangely familiar. "You've come," the woman said, her voice soft and melodic. "I have been waiting for you, Daniel." "How do you know my name?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "I know more than your name," the woman replied, her voice now sharp, almost knowing. "I know what you seek." Daniel took a cautious step forward, the cat now standing beside him, its gaze unwavering. "What do you know about the curse?" The woman stepped closer, the darkness seeming to part around her as though she belonged to the shadows. "The curse binds not only your family, but this land itself. Your ancestors made a pact, and now you must finish what they started, whether you wish to or not." Daniel swallowed hard. The weight of her words settled on his shoulders like an anchor. "How do I break it?" "You must enter the heart of the curse," the woman said, "and destroy the source. But beware, Daniel. The darkness will fight you." The woman's cryptic words hung in the air long after she had disappeared into the trees, leaving Daniel with more questions than answers. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. The cat remained at his side, watching the forest with a deep, unsettling intensity. He stood motionless, weighing his options. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees thickening, the shadows growing darker. The feeling of being watched crept over him, making his skin prickle. He had been drawn here for a reason, but he wasn't sure he was ready to face whatever that reason might be. The woman's words echoed in his mind. Enter the heart of the curse. What did that mean? And what was the source of the curse? As if reading his thoughts, the cat padded ahead, stopping at the base of an ancient oak tree. Its branches stretched high above, the gnarled roots twisted like hands reaching for the earth. The cat let out a low growl and glanced back at Daniel as if urging him to follow. Daniel hesitated, but something in the cat's gaze told him that this was no ordinary creature. The cat was more than just an animal. It was a guide, a protector, maybe even a part of the curse itself. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped forward, the leaves crunching beneath his boots as he approached the oak. The tree seemed to hum with energy, a faint vibration that reverberated through the ground. He placed his hand on the rough bark, and instantly a sharp pain shot through his arm. He pulled back, wincing. The pain faded almost as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a strange warmth that spread through his body. The cat meowed softly, then disappeared into the darkness, leaving Daniel alone with the tree. Without thinking, he stepped forward and knelt by the roots, brushing away the dirt. Beneath the earth, he found something hard, an object buried deep. His fingers wrapped around it, pulling it free. It was a key, small but intricately carved, its design matching the symbols he had seen in the journal. This was it, the key to the heart of the curse. Daniel's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure what awaited him, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. The wind howled through the trees as Daniel stood by the ancient oak, holding the key in his hand. His heart raced, the implications of what he had discovered swirling in his mind. He glanced down at the key, now feeling its weight in a way that felt almost ominous. The cat had disappeared into the night, leaving him to face whatever lay ahead alone. It wasn't until the forest grew eerily silent that Daniel noticed the change. The air shifted. A presence lingered, unseen but undeniable, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The shadows thickened, forming shapes, faces, and then he heard it, a soft, mournful voice. "Daniel!" He spun around, his eyes searching for the source of the voice. There, in the moonlit clearing ahead, stood a figure. It was Sophia. She looked the same as the day she had died. Pale, her hair falling in waves around her shoulders, her eyes hollow with an emptiness that made his blood run cold. "Sophia?" Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. She looked at him with a sadness so deep it seemed to seep from her very being. "I need your help," she said, her voice distant, almost ethereal. "I don't know how," Daniel replied, shaking his head. "I've tried everything. You must undo what Father did," Sophia interrupted softly. "He didn't know what he was doing, Daniel. The curse, it's worse than he ever realized. He was trying to save me, but he only made it worse." The weight of her words settled in his chest, pressing down on him with crushing force. "The key you found," Sophia continued, her gaze intense. "It's not just a key to the ritual. It's a key to the truth. It can open the door, but only if you're willing to pay the price." Daniel clenched his fists. He wasn't sure if this was truly his sister or some trick of the curse, but the desperation in her voice was real, and he couldn't ignore it. "What price?" Daniel asked, already dreading the answer. Sophia's ghost looked at him one last time. "The price of my soul." The cold of the forest seemed to seep into Daniel's very bones as he stood in front of Sophia's ghost. He could feel the weight of her words pressing on him like a heavy fog. The key in his pocket burned with a strange energy, as if calling him to action. "Sophia," Daniel began, but the words caught in his throat. The question hung in the air. Could he really undo what had been done? Sophia's ghost smiled faintly, a sad, knowing smile. "You must finish the ritual, Daniel. The key you found is the final piece, but you cannot do it alone." Daniel's heart pounded. "I don't even know what to do. I don't know where to go or how to break the curse." Sophia stepped forward, her ghostly form shimmering in the moonlight. "You must go to the place where it all began. The old church in the valley. It is there that the ritual began, and it is there that it must end." Daniel felt a shiver run through him, not from the cold, but from a deep, foreboding dread. The church had been abandoned for decades, its crumbling walls a haunting reminder of forgotten times. But Sophia's words were clear. This was where the curse had taken root, and where it could be undone. "Promise me," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling, "that you'll finish it. Promise me you'll end it." Daniel nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. What if he couldn't? What if he wasn't strong enough? As if reading his thoughts, Sophia's ghost spoke one last time. "The key will guide you. Trust it." And with that, she faded, leaving Daniel standing in the dark, alone in the forest, the key burning in his pocket. The next morning, Daniel set out for the church in the valley. The cat had returned to him, as though it had been waiting for him to make up his mind. It trailed behind him, a silent companion, as he walked through the woods toward the distant hills. The journey to the valley felt longer than it had any other time, the forest seeming to stretch on endlessly. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of Daniel's footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. When he finally arrived at the old church, the sight that greeted him was both beautiful and terrifying. The church was in ruins, its stone walls cracked and weathered, ivy creeping over its shattered windows like a veil. It was an abandoned relic of the past, yet it held a strange, magnetic pull. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as he approached the heavy wooden doors. His heart raced, the amulet pressing against his chest like a living thing. The key, his father's legacy, Sophia's last plea, had led him here, to this forgotten place. He stepped inside. The interior was even darker than he expected. the air thick with dust and decay. As he moved deeper into the church, his footsteps echoed off the stone walls. It was clear that no one had stepped foot in this place for a long time, but Daniel felt it, the presence of something powerful, something ancient, and something deeply, darkly malevolent. And then he saw it. In the center of the church, where the altar had once stood, was an intricate stone circle, inscribed with the same symbols he had seen in his father's journal. Daniel approached it cautiously, the key heavy in his hand. It was time. Time to face whatever had been unleashed by his family's pact. He knelt beside the stone circle, placing the key in the center. As soon as he did, the ground trembled beneath him, and the air crackled with energy. The curse had begun to wake. The ground shook violently, sending Daniel to the floor. The church seemed to come alive with an otherworldly force, the walls pulsing as though breathing with a life of their own. Daniel scrambled to his feet, his breath shallow as the air around him thickened. The symbols on the stone circle began to glow, casting eerie, shifting shadows against the crumbling walls. He reached into his pocket, feeling for the amulet. It was warm now, almost too warm, as though it had a pulse of its own. When he pulled it out, the amulet seemed to resonate with the power in the air. He could feel it in his bones, the energy building around him, intensifying with every second. The stone circle was reacting, the symbols shifting and changing before his eyes. The key he had placed in the center started to glow as well, and Daniel's heart raced as he realized that the ritual was beginning. The amulet, the key, everything was coming together. But something was wrong. With a sickening crack, the amulet broke in his hands. The pieces tumbled to the ground, scattering across the stone floor. Panic surged through Daniel. "No," he whispered, "this can't be happening." The cat, which had been silently watching from the shadows, suddenly hissed and darted forward, stopping near the broken pieces of the amulet. It pawed at one of the fragments, but Daniel could see something in the cat's eyes, an ancient, knowing sadness. Something was missing, something crucial. Without the complete amulet, he couldn't finish the ritual. Daniel stared at the broken amulet pieces, disbelief running through his veins like ice. The ritual had already begun, but without the amulet's power, he wasn't sure how to stop it. His heart pounded as the ground trembled again, more violently this time, as though the very church itself was shaking under the weight of the curse. The cat's mournful meow broke through his panic, drawing his attention. The feline seemed intent on something. It pawed at the broken pieces of the amulet, and then, with a soft growl, turned its gaze toward Daniel. He could see the knowing look in the cat's eyes. "You knew," Daniel whispered. "You knew this would happen." The cat did not respond, but instead jumped onto the stone circle, positioning itself in the center, its fur standing on end. Daniel's pulse quickened as he watched the creature's movements. Something ancient was at play here, something much larger than him, something that had been lying dormant for years. Then, without warning, the air around him seemed to shift. The atmosphere thickened, a suffocating force pressing in on him from all sides. The ground below the circle cracked open, revealing a dark, yawning chasm that stretched deep into the earth. From the chasm, tendrils of shadow began to rise. They swirled in a chaotic dance, pulling the very light from the room. Daniel took a step back, fear gripping him. The cat's eyes glowed, its pupils narrowed as it looked into the swirling darkness. There was no going back now. Daniel had to act. With trembling hands, he scooped up the pieces of the shattered amulet. The fragments sparked in his palms as if alive, thrumming with an energy that was neither good nor evil, but something in between, something that demanded respect. He could feel the pull of the darkness, drawing him closer to the chasm. But there was something inside him, a flicker of defiance that refused to yield. With no time to waste, he placed the fragments back into the stone circle, hoping for the best. As soon as the amulet fragments touched the center of the circle, an explosion of light filled the church. Daniel shielded his eyes, the brightness almost blinding. The ground rumbled beneath his feet, the chasm expanding as the dark tendrils reached out toward him, threatening to consume everything in their path. The cat hissed sharply, its eyes blazing with an unnatural fire as it leapt from the stone circle. The light from the amulet intensified, pushing back the darkness, but Daniel could feel the energy within the church rapidly depleting. Suddenly, the cat stopped at the edge of the chasm, its body rigid, as though it was facing something only it could see. Daniel's heart pounded as he watched. The creature's movements seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if it knew what had to be done. Then, in an instant, everything clicked. The cat wasn't just a guide, it wasn't simply a passive observer in this whole ordeal. It was part of the curse. It had been with him all along for a reason. The cat turned to Daniel, its eyes wide and intense. It was trying to communicate. Without thinking, Daniel rushed forward, grabbing the cat just as the darkness seemed to lunge at them. The cat wriggled out of his grasp, darting into the shadows of the chasm. In that moment, Daniel understood. The cat was going to sacrifice itself. "No!" Daniel cried out, reaching for the cat. But it was already gone, vanishing into the abyss. A wave of despair crashed over him. The cat, the very creature that had guided him to this point, had chosen to face the darkness alone. Yet he couldn't afford to let it go. He needed to act quickly, or everything would be lost. As the cat disappeared into the chasm, Daniel stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The darkness had subsided slightly, but the church was still in chaos. The stone circle continued to glow faintly, but the energy was uneven, pulsing erratically, as though something was trying to break free from the chasm below. Daniel's mind raced. He had to stop whatever was happening, or the curse would consume everything. He reached down, picking up the broken amulet fragments once more. The pieces fit together in his palm, but this time they felt different. They were pulsing with energy, far stronger than before, as if the cat's sacrifice had somehow unlocked the amulet's true power. Suddenly, the walls of the church began to shift. Ancient symbols, ones he'd seen in his father's journal, glowed with an otherworldly light. They etched themselves into the stone, creating a path leading toward the altar where the ritual had first begun. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest as he realized the truth. The curse wasn't just a family affair. It was an ancient pact made with something far older, far more powerful. This wasn't just about breaking a cycle of death. This was about stopping an eternal darkness from spilling into the world. As he walked toward the altar, the church seemed to hum, vibrating with an ancient energy. He could hear whispers, the faint echoes of those who had come before him, each one trapped by the curse, their voices lost in time. Daniel could feel the weight of their presence, urging him to finish what they had started. This was the final test, the culmination of everything he had learned, and he wasn't going to let it end in failure. Daniel stood at the altar, the broken amulet now fully restored, glowing with a bright, fierce light. The chasm in the center of the church had closed, but the darkness still lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. He could hear the whispers growing louder, the voices of those who had sacrificed everything to stop the curse. But there was one thing they hadn't been able to do: destroy the heart of the curse, the source of its power. And now it was his turn. The air around him crackled with energy, and Daniel could feel the weight of the choice before him. This was the moment where everything would change. He could finish what had been started, end the curse forever, but at a cost. He had already seen what the ritual demanded: life for life, a soul for a soul. The cat had already made its sacrifice. But what about Daniel? What would he be willing to give? As the whispers reached a crescendo, Daniel knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about saving his family. It was about saving the world from an ancient darkness that would otherwise consume everything. The cost was high, but it was the only way. He stepped forward, placing the amulet on the altar, ready to face whatever would come next. Daniel placed the restored amulet on the altar, its glow bright and steady, casting long shadows on the cracked walls of the ancient church. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, a deep and overwhelming sense of responsibility. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, echoing off the stone and swirling around him. It was as if the entire church was alive, waiting for him to make the final move. The chasm, now closed, felt deceptively calm, but Daniel knew the true danger lay beneath the surface. The curse hadn't just bound his family. It had seeped into the very earth, into the land itself. If he failed, everything would be lost. With trembling hands, he reached out and touched the amulet. The moment his fingers made contact, the air around him crackled with energy. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the altar erupted in a blinding light. The room seemed to bend, twisting, as if it were being pulled apart by unseen forces. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he looked into the blinding light. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. He saw glimpses of faces, ancient figures, long forgotten, trapped in time. They looked at him with pleading eyes, their voices lost in the void. These were the souls of those who had failed before him, who had made the pact with the darkness and never escaped. But now, it was his turn. As the light began to fade, Daniel's mind raced. He had expected to face some sort of trial, but this was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The air felt thick with the presence of something ancient, something not quite human. It was the curse, but it was also something more, something beyond comprehension. From the darkness, a voice whispered, deep and resonant, "You have come far, Daniel, farther than any before you. But now you must make a choice." The ground beneath Daniel cracked open again, this time revealing a figure cloaked in shadow. Its face was obscured, but its presence was overwhelming. The very air around it seemed to warp with dark energy. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. "I am the heart of the curse," the figure replied, its voice cold as ice. "I am the force that has bound your family, your land, and your soul. I am the price of your ancestors' bargain. And now you must decide. Will you join me, or will you destroy me?" Daniel's mind reeled. This was the choice he had been preparing for, but hearing it laid out so clearly made the reality even more terrifying. The curse was not just a force of evil. It was alive, sentient, and it wanted something from him. It was offering him a way out, a way to end it all. But at a cost. "What will happen if I destroy you?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking with the weight of his decision. "The curse will end," the shadow answered, "but so will everything you know. Your world, your life, your family. They will all cease to exist, and you will be free, but at a great price." Daniel took a deep breath. He could feel the pull of the darkness, the temptation to end the curse once and for all. But at what cost? He wasn't sure if he could sacrifice everything, even for freedom. "Your family has already paid the price," the shadow whispered, its voice like velvet. "Now, it is your turn." The choice was unbearable. Daniel stood at the altar, the amulet glowing steadily in his hand, as the shadowy figure before him waited in eerie silence. He could feel its eyes on him, the pressure of the decision weighing on him like 1,000 stones. He wanted to save his family. He wanted to end the curse, to make sure that no one else would have to suffer the way his ancestors had. But could he really erase everything? Could he destroy his life, his memories, the very people he loved, all for the sake of a bargain made centuries ago? The whispers grew louder, as if the voices of the lost souls around him were urging him to make the right choice. But what was the right choice? There was no clear answer. The shadow seemed to sense his doubt. "If you destroy me, the world will reset," it murmured. "All the pain, all the suffering, it will vanish. But in doing so, your life as you know it will cease. Your memories will be erased. You will never have known your family, never have loved or lost. It will all be gone." Daniel's heart sank. To destroy the curse meant to erase everything, and that was a fate worse than death. He clenched the amulet in his hand, trying to steady his thoughts. There had to be another way. Daniel's mind spun, his thoughts racing, as the shadow loomed in front of him, its presence suffocating. He couldn't afford to make a wrong move. The choice felt impossible, like a cruel trick of fate. The curse had consumed his family for generations, and now it demanded the ultimate sacrifice. But then, something inside Daniel snapped. He thought of Sophia, of her face before her death, of the pain and loss that had haunted him. He thought of the cat, his only true ally in this twisted nightmare. It had sacrificed itself, faced the darkness in a way Daniel couldn't. "I'm not afraid of you," Daniel said suddenly, his voice more resolute than he had ever felt before. The shadow tilted its head, almost amused. "You think you can defeat me?" "I know I can," Daniel replied, his hand gripping the amulet tighter. "I won't let you win. Not like this." The shadow's form seemed to ripple with dark energy, swirling around him in a storm of blackness. Daniel could feel its power, its malice, trying to overwhelm him. But there was something inside him, something he had discovered along his journey, that burned brighter than the darkness. The amulet in his hand pulsed with power, and Daniel could hear a voice, his father's voice, whispering in his mind. "Finish what I started, son. Don't let the darkness consume us." Daniel stepped forward, his resolve hardening. The time had come. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of the choice before him. The shadow shifted, as if it were testing his resolve, its presence filling the church like a storm. But Daniel stood firm, the amulet glowing in his hand, its power surging with every heartbeat. "Enough," Daniel said, his voice steady. "You have no hold over me." With a final, desperate roar, the shadow lunged at him, its tendrils reaching for him, trying to drag him into the darkness. But Daniel was ready. He raised the amulet high, focusing all the strength he had left into it. The amulet flared with light, blinding and pure, a burst of energy so intense that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the church. The shadow screamed, its form unraveling as the light consumed it. The ground trembled, the chasm widening once again, but this time, it was not the darkness that emerged. It was light, overwhelming and all-encompassing. For a moment, everything went silent. The church stood silent, the air still and heavy as the light faded. Daniel blinked against the brightness, his vision slowly adjusting to the dim surroundings. The shadow was gone. The air felt different now, lighter, as though the very essence of the curse had been torn away. But Daniel knew that this victory wasn't the end of the story. The darkness had been banished, but the cost was still unclear. He turned, half expecting the shadow to return, but the altar was empty. The swirling energy that had once enveloped the room was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to breathe, feeling the weight of the amulet in his hand, the very thing that had tied his family to this cursed fate. He could feel its power even now, but it no longer felt oppressive. It had done its job. Then, as though the church itself were breathing a sigh of relief, the walls cracked once more, and from the cracks emerged a figure. A familiar figure. "Sophia," Daniel whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Sophia stepped forward, her form ethereal, like a dream, but still undeniably real. Her eyes met his, filled with the sadness he had seen before, yet also with a peace that had eluded her in life. "You did it, Daniel," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper in the silence. Daniel reached for her, his heart racing. "How is this possible? What's happening?" Sophia smiled, a sad but tender smile. "The curse is broken, Daniel. Your family, it's free. And so am I." Daniel's heart ached, a mixture of joy and sorrow flooding his chest. He had done it. He had ended the curse. But what did it mean for Sophia, for everything they had known? "What now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sophia's smile faded, and she stepped closer to him. "Now, you have to let go. Let go of me, of the past. You can't keep holding on. You're free to live, Daniel. Live for both of us. Daniel stood motionless, his mind reeling from the sight of Sophia, so real, yet so distant. He had dreamed of this moment, of seeing her again, of telling her everything he had gone through. But now, standing in front of her, he wasn't sure what to say. "I don't want to let you go," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The pain of losing her had never truly left him. Even though he had been trying to break the curse for so long, part of him had never been able to move on from her death. Sophia's eyes softened. "You've already let me go, Daniel. You just don't realize it. This curse, it has bound you in more ways than you know. And now that it's broken, you can finally live the life you deserve." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. The weight of everything, the years of suffering, the endless nights searching for answers, seemed to lift all at once. But as it lifted, a new emptiness remained in its place. He had freed his family from the curse, but at the cost of his memories of them. Sophia was right. Letting go was the only way forward. "Is this the last time I'll see you?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sophia nodded, her face full of love and sadness. "It's time, Daniel. You've done more than anyone could have asked of you. Now it's your turn to live. And I'll always be with you, in your heart." With that, Sophia began to fade, her form dissolving into the light that had once engulfed the church. Daniel reached out, but she was gone, leaving only the faintest trace of her presence in the air. For a long time, Daniel stood in silence. The church was quiet now, the curse broken, but the weight of his journey had not left him. The past, the memories, the pain, it was all still with him. And yet, he knew that this was a new beginning. The church was still, the last remnants of the curse dissipating into nothingness. Daniel looked around, feeling the emptiness of the place now that the weight of the curse had been lifted. He felt lighter, yet there was an odd heaviness in his chest that he couldn't quite shake. The amulet in his hand pulsed with a faint glow, no longer a symbol of power and danger, but a reminder of everything that had happened. He had done what he came to do, broken the curse, freed his family, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something he still had to understand. He turned and walked out of the church, the cold air greeting him as he stepped into the daylight. The world outside had moved on, untouched by the horrors that had haunted him for so long. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the sun shining down, as if nothing had ever happened. But Daniel knew better. He had seen the truth. He had broken the cycle of death, but in doing so, he had also broken the bond to his past. He was no longer bound by the curse. But what did that mean for his future? As he walked down the path, he could feel the weight of the choices he had made. The freedom he had fought for came at a steep price. He had saved his family, but at the cost of everything he had known. There was no going back, no returning to the life he had once lived. The world was new, but it was also unknown. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. He was free. Weeks passed, and the weight of the past began to settle in. Daniel had returned to his home, the place where he had once lived with his family, but everything felt different now. The house was quiet, the rooms empty of the laughter and love that had once filled them. The memories were there, buried deep within him. He could still remember the smell of his mother's cooking, the sound of his father's voice, the way Sophia's smile had always lit up the room. But those memories were fading, slipping further away as the days passed. He couldn't hold on to them forever. He spent his days going through old photographs, trying to piece together a life that no longer existed. There was no one left to share it with, no one who remembered the family they had been, the people they had once been. But even as the memories faded, Daniel knew he couldn't forget what he had done. He had saved them. He had freed them all from the curse, even if it meant losing himself in the process. The emptiness was overwhelming at times, but Daniel knew he couldn't dwell on the past. He had to keep moving forward. There was a whole world out there waiting for him, a world he could now experience without the burden of the curse hanging over him. One morning, Daniel woke early to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light across the landscape. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of peace. He walked outside, taking in the quiet beauty of the world around him. The trees, the fields, the sky. Everything seemed so vibrant, so full of life. It was as if the world had been reborn, just like him. Daniel realized that the past was no longer his prison. He had broken the chains, and now it was time to live. Time to build a new life, to embrace the future and leave behind the shadows of the past. As he stood there, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, Daniel knew that he was free, and that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all. In the weeks following the breaking of the curse, Daniel began to adjust to his new reality. The burden of the past had been lifted, but the world he returned to felt foreign, distant. His family's house, once full of life and laughter, was now an empty shell of memories. He had to rebuild his life, piece by piece, and it felt like every corner he turned, something reminded him of what was lost. Though the world around him seemed unchanged, Daniel's perception had shifted. The curse had cast a long shadow over his existence, and now that it was gone, everything seemed both brighter and colder. There was an odd sense of loneliness that clung to him, and for a long while, he didn't know how to fill the silence. He visited the old church from time to time, finding solace in the place where his journey had begun. It was as if the church still held a piece of the magic that had once filled the air. Every visit reminded him of the choices he had made and the cost of freedom. He wondered if Sophia was truly gone, or if she lingered somewhere in the ether, watching over him. It was on one such visit to the church that Daniel noticed something strange. As he walked through the door, he felt a chill in the air, an unfamiliar presence. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't alone. Turning slowly, Daniel scanned the room. The church was empty, save for the dust motes floating in the sunlight. But then, in the far corner, he saw it. A figure, faint and blurry, standing at the altar. It was a silhouette, a shadow that seemed to flicker like a fading memory. "Who's there?" Daniel called, his voice echoing through the stillness. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for him. His heart began to race, a feeling of dread creeping over him. Was it another manifestation of the curse? Had he not truly broken free? Without thinking, Daniel approached the figure. As he did, it seemed to shift, fading in and out of existence, until finally it dissipated entirely. A cold breeze swept through the church, as though something had passed through him. Daniel stood in the silence, shaken. He knew he had seen something, but he wasn't sure what. The presence in the church felt too real to be a figment of his imagination. Could the curse still be at work? Had he truly broken its hold? The unsettling encounter at the church lingered in Daniel's mind. He tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, or perhaps a lingering effect of his memories, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He had destroyed the curse, or so he thought. But that shadow, that presence, it couldn't be explained away. Daniel began to question everything he had believed. Had the curse truly been broken, or had he only severed part of it? Was there a piece of it that remained, lurking in the shadows, waiting to re-emerge? Determined to find answers, Daniel began researching the origins of the curse once more. He returned to the old texts his father had left behind, the cryptic books that had helped him uncover the truth about his family's past. There was something he missed. He knew it. There had to be a deeper layer to the curse, something he hadn't fully understood. Days turned into weeks as he pored over the texts, piecing together fragmented pieces of the puzzle. What he found troubled him even more. The curse, it seemed, wasn't something that could simply be erased. It had roots in something much older, much more complex than he had ever imagined. He discovered references to an ancient being, a force of darkness older than time itself. The curse had not just been bound to his family, it was part of something far greater, a force that had been waiting for the right moment to strike again. Daniel's world began to unravel as he connected the dots. The curse wasn't just a family affliction, it was a cosmic force that had been dormant for centuries, bound to a realm beyond comprehension. It had been fed by the sacrifices of his ancestors, and in breaking it, Daniel had unwittingly unleashed something far worse. The texts spoke of a time when the curse would return in full force, when the darkness would reclaim what had been taken from it. That time was now. Daniel's pulse quickened as he read the final passage of the book. The curse had never been truly broken. It had only been delayed. And now, with the amulet's destruction, the force that had once been contained was free to wreak havoc on the world once more. Fear gripped him. The church, the amulet, the ancient beings. It had all been a part of a larger game, one that he was not fully prepared to face. He had thought he had won, but in truth, he had only opened the door to something far worse. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. His mind raced with the information he had uncovered. The curse was not over. It had merely been in hiding, biding its time. He had broken the seal, and now the darkness was coming. In the quiet of his room, he could almost feel it, the pull of something ancient and malevolent drawing closer. The air felt thick with tension, as though something unseen was waiting to strike. He knew what had to be done, but the cost of what he would have to face next was unimaginable. He had to return to the church. There was no other choice. The answers were there, hidden in the remnants of the past. The force that had been sealed away was not gone. It was still waiting to rise again, and Daniel had to find a way to stop it. He grabbed the remnants of the amulet from his desk, the shattered pieces still glowing faintly in the moonlight. He didn't know what they meant, but he hoped they could help. The darkness would not be defeated by brute strength alone. He would need something more, something ancient, something forgotten. As he stood in the doorway, ready to face whatever lay ahead, Daniel felt a sense of inevitability wash over him. The curse was not gone. It was simply waiting for the right moment to return. And that moment, it seemed, had arrived. Daniel stood outside the church, the night air cold against his skin. The silence around him was suffocating, as if the entire world was holding its breath. He knew that what lay ahead would change everything. His discovery of the truth, that the curse was never truly broken, had shaken him to his core. Now, he was about to face the darkness that had been dormant for centuries. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, the heavy wooden doors of the church creaking as he pushed them open. The interior was cloaked in shadows, the once sacred space now feeling more like a tomb. The atmosphere was thick with an eerie presence, as if the very air itself was alive. Inside, the church seemed different. The altar, the pews, everything appeared unchanged, but Daniel knew better. The darkness had already begun to seep in. As he walked deeper into the church, the floorboards creaked beneath his feet, echoing in the otherwise silent space. He reached the altar, his eyes scanning the surroundings. There was something in the air that made him uneasy. He wasn't alone. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to stretch and move, as if alive. The force was drawing closer. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the church, extinguishing the candles that flickered along the walls. A figure appeared in front of the altar, its shape obscured by the darkness. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He knew this presence. It was the same shadow that had haunted his dreams, the force that had cursed his family for generations. "You've come too late," a voice whispered, its tone hollow and menacing. Daniel's hands trembled as he gripped the shattered pieces of the amulet. He knew the force was right. The darkness had returned, and he had little time to stop it. The battle for his family's freedom wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The shadow loomed larger, and Daniel's pulse quickened as the air grew heavier. It was the thing that had cursed his family for so long, the entity that had lingered in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was an ancient evil, one that had never truly been defeated, and now it had returned to reclaim what had been stolen from it. Daniel stepped forward, clutching the amulet fragments in his hand. The power that had once been tied to it seemed to stir in the air around him. The darkness, too, seemed to recognize the remnants of its former prison. "You cannot stop me," the voice hissed, echoing through the vast, empty church. "You think you have broken the curse, but you have merely delayed the inevitable. My return is destiny." Daniel's mind raced as he tried to steady himself. The truth had come crashing down. His family's curse had always been tied to something far more dangerous than he had imagined. The amulet, the church, the rituals, they were all part of an ancient pact, one that had bound his bloodline to the darkness. But Daniel couldn't give up. He wouldn't let it win. He had to find a way to stop it, even if it meant facing the deepest, darkest parts of his soul. He could feel the power of the amulet surging in his hand, the fragments pulsing as if they were alive. "You may be ancient," Daniel said, his voice firm despite the fear that gripped his heart, "but I will not let you destroy my family's future." The shadows twisted around him, and the voice of the darkness became louder, more insistent. It was as if the very air in the church was alive, pressing in on him from all sides. Daniel could feel his resolve weakening, his fear threatening to consume him. But he had made a promise to his family, and he couldn't let them down. The darkness surged forward, a tangible force that seemed to pull at the very essence of his being. Daniel fought to stand firm, but the pull was overwhelming. It wanted to take him, to drag him into the abyss from which it came. For a moment, Daniel faltered, his thoughts clouded by the weight of the curse, by the power of the force that sought to reclaim him. He felt the darkness creeping into his mind, whispering to him, telling him that there was no hope, no escape. But then, a voice cut through the haze. It was a familiar voice, Sophia's. "Daniel," she whispered, as if from a far distance. "You are stronger than this. You've already broken the chains. Don't let it take you." The sound of her voice brought him back to himself. He remembered the love they had shared, the bond that had kept him going through the darkest moments. He was not alone. He never had been. With renewed strength, Daniel lifted the amulet fragments high, the pieces glowing with a brilliant light. The darkness recoiled, as if it feared the power he held. The shadows writhed and shrank back, but Daniel knew it wouldn't be enough. He had to destroy the source, the being that had caused all of this. Daniel stood firm, the fragments of the amulet glowing brightly in his hand. The darkness hissed, recoiling from the light, but it wasn't finished. It would not go down without a fight. "You cannot defeat me, Daniel," the voice growled, its tone filled with rage. "I am eternal. I am the darkness that has always existed, the force that will never be vanquished." Daniel's heart raced as he took a step forward. The darkness may have been ancient, but he wasn't fighting alone. He had his family's legacy, his love for Sophia, and the strength of his own will. With a cry of defiance, Daniel raised the amulet fragments higher. The light from the pieces grew blinding, filling the church with its brilliance. The darkness shrieked, a sound that shook the very foundations of the church, but it was no match for the power of the light. "Begone!" Daniel shouted, and with a final surge of energy, the fragments of the amulet exploded in a blinding flash. The darkness screamed in its final moments as it was torn apart, vanishing into nothingness. The shadows that had once filled the church were gone, leaving only silence in their wake. Daniel collapsed to his knees, exhausted but triumphant. The curse was finally broken. The darkness had been defeated. His family and the world were free. The church stood in peaceful silence, the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. Daniel sat in the center of the church, his body weary, but his spirit at peace. The battle was over. The darkness that had haunted his family for generations was no more. And now, for the first time in his life, Daniel could truly breathe. As the sunlight warmed his skin, Daniel felt a sense of calm wash over him. The shadows were gone, and with them, the burden of the past. He had freed his family, freed himself, and freed the world from an ancient evil. Sophia's voice echoed in his mind, a whisper of love and encouragement. He could almost feel her presence, as if she was still with him. And in a way, she was. Her spirit lived on in him, in the choices he had made, in the life he had yet to live. Standing up, Daniel looked toward the future. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time, it felt like a road full of possibility. The past was behind him, and the future was his to shape. The darkness had been defeated, and a new dawn had arrived. Daniel had spent days alone in the church, contemplating the victory and the cost. The destruction of the darkness had not come without sacrifice. He was left with a sense of emptiness, as though something important had been lost in the battle. Yet, he knew that it was necessary. The world was finally free from the ancient evil that had plagued it for so long. But there were no celebrations, no one to witness the end of the curse. Daniel had fought this battle alone, with only the shattered remnants of his family's legacy to guide him. He knew that the darkness had left a void in the world, and it was up to him to ensure that peace would be maintained. He had to rebuild not only his own life, but the world around him. As he walked through the church's grounds, Daniel noticed how the world seemed to have changed. The air felt fresher, the skies bluer, as if the curse had cast a long shadow over everything. Now that it was gone, there was a sense of clarity. He realized that his journey wasn't over. The battle against the darkness had only been one chapter, and now he had to figure out how to live in a world where the unimaginable had been real. It wasn't long before Daniel received an unexpected visitor. One evening, as the sky darkened and the church lay silent, a figure appeared in the doorway. At first, Daniel thought his mind was playing tricks on him, for the figure was unmistakable. It was Sophia, but it wasn't possible. He had seen her disappear, her spirit having left him in the wake of the battle. Yet here she stood, her eyes meeting his with the same warmth he had once known. "Sophia?" Daniel whispered, unsure if he was dreaming or if she was truly standing before him. Sophia smiled gently, her form shimmering in the dim light. "I'm not truly here, Daniel, but my spirit remains. I have been with you through everything, and now it is time for you to live the life you've fought for." Daniel's heart ached with longing. The pain of losing her had never fully faded, but hearing her voice again brought him a sense of peace. "I thought I had lost you forever," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You haven't lost me," she replied softly. "I'm in your heart. I always will be. But now it's your turn to carry on. You've freed the world from the darkness. You've freed yourself. It's time to heal." Her form began to fade as the words lingered in the air. "Goodbye, Daniel," she whispered, her voice fading like a distant echo. The days that followed Sophia's visit were filled with a sense of both hope and uncertainty. Daniel had been given a chance at a new life, but it wasn't going to be easy. There was so much to rebuild: his family, his future, and his own sense of self. He returned to his childhood home, the place where so many memories had been made. It was a shell of what it had once been, but Daniel was determined to make it a place of warmth once again. He began to restore the house, each nail and brushstroke a way of mending the pieces of his broken past. As he worked, he thought about the people he had left behind, the ones who had known nothing of the curse that had shaped his life. His friends, his family. How could he ever explain to them what he had gone through? How could he tell them about the battles he had fought, the darkness he had vanquished? But as he stood in the newly renovated living room, he realized something. He didn't have to explain everything. He didn't have to carry the weight of the past with him anymore. The curse had been broken, and his story was his own to share, in his own time. One morning, Daniel decided to leave the house and explore the world beyond. He had spent so much time focused on the darkness, on the fight that had consumed him for so long. Now, he needed to see what lay beyond the shadow of his past. He needed to find his place in a world that had been forever altered by his actions. He traveled to nearby towns, meeting new people and seeing new places. There was a sense of freedom in it, a feeling that he was no longer bound by the curse, no longer a prisoner of his family's legacy. Everywhere he went, he saw signs of hope. People rebuilding, families coming together, communities healing. Daniel realized that the battle he had fought wasn't just about destroying darkness. It was about creating light. It was about healing, not just for himself, but for the world that had been touched by the curse. And as he walked through each new place, he began to feel the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders. There was still much to do, but for the first time, he felt like he was truly moving forward. Months passed, and Daniel found himself growing stronger, both physically and emotionally. He had learned to embrace the changes in his life and to see them as opportunities for growth. His journey had been one of pain, loss, and darkness, but now it was one of renewal and hope. One day, while visiting a small village, Daniel met someone new, someone who reminded him of the person he used to be. Her name was Lily, and she was kind, compassionate, and full of life. She too had experienced loss, but instead of being consumed by it, she had learned to move forward, to find joy in the small things. Over time, Daniel and Lily grew close, finding in each other a bond that neither had expected. Their relationship was built on understanding, on the shared knowledge of loss and healing. They talked for hours about their lives, their dreams, and their hopes for the future. Daniel had once thought that he would never love again, that his heart had been broken beyond repair. But Lily showed him that there was always room for new beginnings, that even the deepest scars could heal over time. And so, Daniel found a new family, a family that wasn't defined by blood or curse, but by the love and support they offered each other. As Daniel and Lily's bond grew, they realized that they shared a desire to help others heal, just as they had. Together, they set out to work in the villages that had been touched by the curse, offering their help to rebuild homes, schools, and lives. They organized healing workshops, providing people with the tools to overcome their pasts and create a future full of hope. Daniel was no longer the man he once was, the man haunted by shadows. He was now a man who had found peace, a man who was helping others find it too. With Lily by his side, he felt like he could take on anything. The darkness was behind him, and together they were creating a world full of light. The work in the villages continued, and Daniel found himself growing even more attached to the people around him. The small acts of kindness and support were healing not just the land, but the souls of those who had been affected by the curse. Daniel no longer felt like a stranger in these places. He felt like a part of the fabric of the world that was being rebuilt from the ashes. He and Lily had created a foundation to help the villagers affected by the curse. The first project they worked on was constructing a community center where people could come together to heal, to share their stories, and to build a sense of unity. It became a hub of activity, a place where people from all walks of life came together to support each other. Every brick laid, every wall built was a symbol of resilience. Daniel realized that this was his purpose now, to help others find the strength he had found in himself, to help them see that healing was possible, even after the darkest of times. The land, once tainted by the curse, was now becoming fertile again. Fields that had been barren for years were beginning to bloom with crops. The air felt lighter, and the sun seemed to shine brighter. The work was hard, but it was rewarding, and Daniel felt proud of what they had accomplished. One evening, as Daniel and Lily stood atop a hill overlooking the village, they watched the sunset together. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt completely at peace. "You know," Lily said softly, her hand gently resting on Daniel's, "I never thought I'd find happiness again. After everything that had happened to me, I thought I was broken. But you, Daniel, you showed me that healing is possible, that there's light at the end of even the darkest tunnels." Daniel smiled, squeezing her hand. "I feel the same way. I was lost for so long, trapped by my past. But with you, I've learned to look forward. You've helped me find a future I never thought was possible." They stood there in silence, watching as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a quiet moment, a peaceful one, and for Daniel, it was a sign that the future was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. With Lily by his side, Daniel knew that he could face whatever came next, knowing that their bond would always keep them strong. Months passed, and the foundation that Daniel and Lily had built continued to grow. It became a beacon of hope for those who had been affected by the curse, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always the possibility of light. The healing workshops, the community support, and the efforts to rebuild homes were all flourishing. As Daniel walked through the villages they had helped, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The land was thriving, the people were strong, and the future was bright. It wasn't just about what he had done for the world. It was about what the world had done for him in return. It had healed him, just as he had helped it heal. He realized that the curse, the darkness, and the battles he had fought were all part of his journey. They had shaped him into the man he was today. A man who could face any challenge, who understood the power of love, community, and resilience. And that was the greatest victory of all. Years passed, and the village that had once been haunted by the curse was now a thriving community. Daniel and Lily had created a legacy of hope, one that would continue long after they were gone. Their work had touched countless lives, and they had inspired others to carry the torch forward, ensuring that the darkness would never return. One day, as Daniel and Lily stood together at the hill once again, they looked out over the village. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the land. It was the beginning of a new day, a new dawn. "Do you ever wonder if we've truly made a difference?" Lily asked, her voice thoughtful. Daniel smiled and placed his hand on her shoulder. "I don't need to wonder. I see it every day in the faces of the people around us. We've done more than we could have ever imagined. And the best part? It's just the beginning." They stood there, watching as the sun climbed higher into the sky, knowing that the future was bright and full of endless possibilities. The darkness had been vanquished, and the light would never fade.